In this video, I'm giving you a brief introduction to the endocrine system. When we're talking about the endocrine system, we are talking about hormones, small chemical messengers that circulate in the blood and regulate a variety of very complex processes in the body. Many of the processes regulated by hormones include those that require coordination between a lot of different systems in the body. And since hormone-based signaling is a little bit slower, it also involves processes that take place over a long period of time. You wouldn't want to use hormones to duck out of the way of an oncoming baseball, but you can use hormones to regulate what you eat, regulate reproduction, growth and development, and your water intake. I should add, and water output. Note that some of these processes are absolutely critical for maintaining homeostasis. So homeostasis is another key idea that you should be thinking of when you're thinking of the endocrine system, because a lot of what the endocrine system does is to keep things in the body within homeostasis, within that balancing range. I do want to point out that there are two different general types of glands that you find in the body: endocrine glands and exocrine glands. Exocrine glands you learn about in the integumentary system when you're talking about the skin, though we'll come back to them in particular when we talk about the digestive tract. Exocrine glands are glands that release non-hormonal substances, and they release them into ducts that carry these substances out to a surface. Either if you're talking about the skin, you're talking about the external surface of the body. If you're talking about the digestive tract or the respiratory tract, you're talking about a internal surface, but it's still non-hormonal substances. So they're not getting into circulation, they're being released to a surface. With the endocrine system, here you are talking about hormones, as we mentioned, and the endocrine glands are ductless, meaning that there's no ducts. So instead, hormones are released by cells into surrounding interstitial fluid, into the extracellular fluid around the cell. And from that interstitial fluid, the hormones drain into the blood, where they get into circulation and circulate throughout the entire body. You can also have mixed glands. Mixed glands secrete substances via both endocrine and exocrine pathways. The pancreas is one example of this. The pancreas has an endocrine function and exocrine function, helping out with digestion. The ovary and testes are also mixed glands, both endocrine and exocrine secretions. I want to take a moment to talk about the different forms of intracellular communication so that we can better understand how endocrine communication or hormonal communication fits in with the other communication systems of the body. Now, the simplest type of intracellular communication is direct communication. In direct communication, you have two neighboring cells that are connected by gap junctions, and you have substances passing from one cell to the other. So with direct communication, the key thing is substances passing directly from one cell to another through gap junctions. In paracrine communication, you have cells releasing a substance that acts on neighboring cells. It's a local effect, though. Paracrine factor factors act on neighboring cells. You can also have something that's called autocrine signaling. Autocrine signaling is where a cell releases a substance that actually affects its own responses. Synaptic communication is what happens in the nervous system. In the nervous system, you have an axon terminal and a target cell separated by just a really small gap, the synapse. And in the axon terminal releases substances into that synaptic cleft to bind to receptors on the target cell. And the substances that control synaptic communication, the substances that are released into the synapse, these are your neurotransmitters. Of these forms of intercellular communication, endocrine is probably most similar to paracrine signaling. You have a cell that releases its substance, but it releases that substance into the blood. The hormone circulates through the blood, leaves the blood, and has an effect on the target cell. So, although there are some similarities between endocrine and paracrine signaling in that the substance is released and acts on target cells, in endocrine signaling, because the hormone gets into circulation, gets into the blood, you can have that hormone acting at a distance. You can also have that hormone acting at multiple sites, wherever the target cells are found. I also want to make a point that what determines, if you take a small signaling molecule and ask whether it is a neurotransmitter, a paracrine factor, or a hormone, what really determines that is what cell is releasing it, and what cell is the target cell, where the target cell is located. If you're talking about a paracrine factor, the target cell is nearby. If you're talking about a neurotransmitter, the target cell is on the other side of the synapse, so very, very close. If you're talking about a hormone, the target cell could be at the complete opposite end of the body, right? So the same molecule can be either a neurotransmitter or a hormone, and sometimes a paracrine factor as well. Oftentimes, in fact, hormones do have paracrine effects. Epinephrine is probably the best example of this. If epinephrine is released by sympathetic nerve fibers onto a target organ, or if it's released in the CNS by nerve fibers, by neurons, it's acting as a neurotransmitter. But if epinephrine is released from the adrenal gland into the blood, it's acting as a hormone. It's all still epinephrine, it's just acting at different distances. Okay, so if hormones are released by endocrine glands and circulating in the blood and going all throughout the entire body, how does that hormone know, quote unquote, know what cells to act on? In other words, what are the target cells? And to discuss that, I need to introduce a very important concept that comes up over and over again in anatomy and physiology, and that's the key and lock model. Shape is very, very critical to the function of hormones, just as it is critical to the function of proteins and cells and organs and bodies. So if a hormone is the key, then that key needs to find the right lock. And the lock is called the hormone's receptor, right? So in these images, the little blue triangle is representing the hormone, and the red chevron thing is representing the receptor. The target cells, the cells that can actually respond to a hormone, those are the cells that express the right receptor. Those are the cells that express a receptor for that particular hormone. Just like a key in a lock, if you put the key into the wrong lock, it can't do anything. Nothing's going to happen. You're not going to be able to unlock. But if you have the right key for the lock, something happens, something changes, the door opens. So here, this one, cell A, is the target cell. It's got the right receptor. The hormone fits. B, in cell B over here, is anything going to happen? Does the hormone fit? B is not a target cell. So the hormone is just going to pass on by. Now, there are many different endocrine glands in the body. These are the major ones and the ones that I want you to know about. You've got the pineal gland up in the brain. You have the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is actually part of the brain. But as we get into discussing the hypothalamus and the relationships between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, you'll see that it is a part of the brain that is closely associated with the endocrine system. The pituitary gland is a major regulator of the endocrine system. The thyroid gland in the neck, the parathyroid glands attached to the, usually found at the back of the thyroid on the dorsal aspect. The adrenal glands, like little hats over the kidneys. And as we'll talk more about, the adrenal glands are really two glands in one. You have the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla. And then we'll talk about the pancreas. We'll touch briefly on the thymus, the ovaries, and the testes. But we'll talk more about the ovaries and testes when we get to the reproductive system, and we'll talk a little bit more about the thymus when we get to the immune system. For all of these glands circled in red, I want you to be able to really tell me a lot about what they do. So, where they're located, rough structure, including the histology, the general functions, what hormones, the functions of the hormones, how the hormones are regulated, and what happens when you have too much of that hormone, that's hypersecretion, and what happens when you have too little of that hormone, that's hyposecretion. The pituitary gland and the hypothalamus aren't really very easy to see on that previous diagram, so they're kind of small. So I'm showing you this to better visualize the pituitary gland in the brain. The pituitary gland kind of dangles off the bottom of the hypothalamus, and it's attached by this little stalk called the infundibulum. That's that narrow bridge of tissue that connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary. And the pituitary gland itself sits in this structure called the sella turcica, which is a like a little divot in the sphenoid bone of the skull that houses the pituitary gland rests in. The pituitary gland is also actually two glands in one. You have the anterior lobe, which is very endocrine, made up of modified epithelial cells secreting hormones. And then you have the posterior lobe, which is actually neuronal tissue. The posterior pituitary is made up of neurons coming from the hypothalamus, axons extending down the infundibulum and terminating in the pituitary. The pituitary gland is often called the master regulator of the endocrine system because it produces so many tropic hormones. Basically, the term tropic hormone refers to hormones that regulate the activity of other endocrine glands, so hormones that regulate the secretion of other hormones. The pituitary is often referred to as the master regulator, but really the hypothalamus, I think, is the true master regulator because the hypothalamus actually regulates the pituitary. So it's the regulator of the regulator. Now, there are a number of different ways that hormones can be stimulated for release. We will go over individual stimuli for particular hormones. In the nervous system, you have reflexes, which are automatic responses to a stimulus carried out through the nervous system. You can also have endocrine reflexes. An endocrine reflex is basically just the secretion of hormones in response to stimuli. Now, some hormones are triggered by other hormones. This is a hormonal stimulus. It makes sense. The terminology makes sense here. In this type of stimulus, you have a releasing hormone that releasing hormone binds to its receptor and causes a response in the target cell that tells the target cell to release a hormone. Right? It might be easier to think of this as basically hormone 1 triggering release of hormone 2. This is how the tropic hormones released from the pituitary, this is how a lot of the tropic hormones act on their target organ. This is also how the hypothalamus controls the anterior pituitary. So one good example of this is TRH, thyrotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, stimulating release of TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary. And there's even one more step because TSH is a tropic hormone. It's thyroid stimulating hormone, so TSH triggers release of thyroid hormone from the thyroid gland. So it's a sequence, a two-step sequence of hormonal triggers. You can also have neural stimuli for hormone release. In neural stimuli, you have neurons directly inducing the release of hormones from target cells. For example, when the sympathetic nervous system, that fight or flight response, when that gets activated, it triggers the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine from the adrenal glands. So it's triggering a hormonal release from the adrenal glands. Also, when you have a nervous system activation of neuronal cell bodies in the hypothalamus, that triggers the release of prolactin and oxytocin from the posterior pituitary. When you have humoral stimuli, what you have is changes in blood, changes in levels of a substance in the blood, and usually this is blood ion or sometimes nutrient levels. So if blood calcium levels, for example, when blood calcium levels get low, that triggers the release of parathyroid hormone from the parathyroid gland. When glucose levels, glucose is a critical nutrient, blood sugar, when glucose levels get high, it triggers the release of insulin from the pancreas. So these are both humoral stimuli. To remember what humoral means, remember that the term humor is an antiquated term for the fluids of the body. So when you think humoral, think basically a change in fluids of the body, the blood. Now, hormone levels are often regulated by feedback loops. In a positive feedback loop is where you have where you have a stimulus triggering a response, and the response increases the stimulus. So if you're looking at hormone levels, what you see is that as you have more of one hormone, you have more of a second hormone. This is the relationship between LH, luteinizing hormone, and estrogen. The more luteinizing hormone you have, the more estrogen you have. That's what we're seeing on this graph. And this diagram over here shows the relationship between the two. The pituitary releases luteinizing hormone, which has a stimulating effect on the ovary, telling the ovary to release estrogen, which triggers more release of luteinizing hormone, and you just have it going around and around and around, escalating the levels of both hormones. So positive feedback loops happen, but negative feedback loops are much more common. And negative feedback loops control hormone release. They limit it. As you go through and you're studying the regulation of specific hormones, look for these negative feedback loops. The relationship between ACTH and glucocorticoid is one example of this. ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, is released by the pituitary. It acts on the adrenal cortex, causes the adrenal cortex to release glucocorticoids, and the glucocorticoid has an inhibitory effect on the release of ACTH, right? So the more ACTH you have, the more glucocorticoid you have, and it in essence shuts itself down. It's a self-limiting loop. So that you don't get too much ACTH or too much glucocorticoid. These negative feedback loops are really critical for homeostasis. When you want enough, but not too much, you'll often find a negative feedback loop. So negative feedback loops are one way to control the amount of endocrine signaling, to control the amount of hormones that are released in the blood by shutting off the stimulation. There are other factors that come into play as well that kind of keep your hormone levels in balance. So once hormones are released, they don't just circulate indefinitely. They are eventually broken down. They're either endocytosed, taken into the target cells and broken down in the target cell, or there may be enzymes in circulation that break the hormone down in the blood. That's what this little Pac-Man here is supposed to represent, is an enzyme ready to chew up, degrade the hormone. Hormones are also excreted, so many hormones can be removed from the blood by the kidneys and excreted in the urine, or these hormones can be taken up by the liver and metabolized into something different, so the hormone is in essence gone. It's not there to signal anymore. Endocrinologists and pharmacists will use the term half-life. Half-life is the length of time it takes for a hormone's blood level to decrease by half. This is a very important consideration if you are looking at someone with deficient hormone levels. If you are looking to treat someone with hormone, you need to know how long that hormone is going to stick around. So that's an important consideration in figuring out how much you're going to give someone. And this half-life concept is also very important in all of pharmacy, because anytime you're administering a drug to a patient, you need to consider how long that drug is going to stick around. Pharmaceutical drugs can get degraded or excreted as well, so they also have a half-life in the body. Now, we'll be talking a lot about endocrine disorders in this unit. Things can go very wrong if you have either too little or too much of a hormone. It's all about homeostasis, and remember, with homeostasis, you need to have a normal range, and if you have either too little or too much, things go wacky. Hyposecretion, remember, is the term that is used when you have too little of a hormone. Hypo, anytime you see that, think less. Hyper, when you see that, you should think more. So hypersecretion is when you have too much of a particular hormone. Now, if you're looking at treating an endocrine disorder and you want to figure out how to make things better, you need to know why that endocrine disorder is happening. So it's important to know whether you have a primary disorder or a secondary disorder. In a primary disorder, you have a defect, a problem with the endocrine gland itself. Sometimes this may be a tumor that's causing hypersecretion or hyposecretion, or maybe a cyst that's pressing on a gland, and this is common in the pituitary, relatively common in the pituitary. You have a cyst that's pressing on it and destroying the tissue, causing hyposecretion. So that would be those would both be examples of primary disorders. It's something wrong with the endocrine gland itself. Secondary disorders are where you have the endocrine gland is fine, but you have a problem with a regulatory organ. So the gland that's actually producing the hormone is fine, but there is something wrong with an organ that usually regulates production. So this might be if you have, say, a problem with the hypothalamus or the pituitary, and the symptoms that you're seeing are due to hypo or hypersecretion of a hormone that's regulated by the pituitary. Then, if that's the case, you need to treat the regulatory organ, figure out the problem there. Cushing's disease, which is the disease you're seeing up here, is a great example of that. Cushing's syndrome is caused by hypersecretion of cortisol. Cortisol is a stress response hormone that's produced by the adrenal glands. And Cushing's syndrome can be caused by either a problem with the adrenal glands, or perhaps like an adrenal tumor, or it can be caused by a problem with the pituitary, because the pituitary releases a hormone that regulates production of cortisol. So if you have too much of that hormone produced, then you have too much cortisol produced, and you develop Cushing's syndrome. This is the normal before showing symptoms child, and this is the child showing symptoms of Cushing's syndrome. Hyposecretion can often be treated by simply replacing the hormone. This is what they do for type 1 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is just a deficiency in insulin production. So the treatment is to replace the insulin. Now, you can also have an endocrine disorder where the secretion, the levels of the hormone are perfectly normal, secretion is just fine. The problem is just that you have a different response to the hormone. Your target organs don't respond to the hormone. You can have target cells that are either resistant or target cells that are hypersensitive. But it's all about the target cell response. If the target cells are resistant to the hormone, that means that they are less responsive, and resistance will look a lot like hyposecretion. Right? You see this in type 2 diabetes. So type 2 diabetes, you may have normal levels of insulin, at least for a while, but your cells can't respond to insulin. So you start seeing the exact same symptoms that someone with low levels of insulin display. If your target cells are hypersensitive, meaning that they respond too strongly to a hormone, the symptoms will look a lot like hypersecretion. So hypersensitivity is really pretty rare. Resistance is much more common. You can figure out, in order to distinguish between altered response and actual differences in secretion, you have to look at the actual levels of hormone. If someone has abnormal symptoms but normal levels of the hormone, it's probably a problem with the target tissue, not the endocrine glands. Alright, this is just scratching the very surface of all that there is to discuss in the endocrine system. We will get more deeply into many of these topics. For now, though, after studying this video, you should be able to answer these questions. You should be able to compare and contrast how the endocrine system communicates to the nervous system, compare and contrast endocrine and exocrine glands, compare and contrast the different types of intercellular communication, explain what makes a target cell for a particular hormone, and discuss the various types of endocrine disorders.